Good afternoon, and welcome to Abraham Lincoln and the American Experience. My name is Deborah Jacobs, and I'm the Rita DiGianardo Holloway University Librarian and Vice Provost for Library Affairs. The Duke Libraries and our co-sponsors are pleased to present Duke alumnus and parent David M. Rubenstein and Duke professor and parent Thavolia Glimpf in conversation about Abraham Lincoln. This program accompanies an exhibition drawn from the David M. Rubenstein Americana collection entitled "To Stand by the Side of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and 19th Century America." The Duke Libraries are grateful to David for loaning these historic materials to Duke so that they might be shared with the Triangle community. We will place a link in the chat with more information about the exhibition. A few housekeeping notes as we begin. We welcome your questions for our speakers. Please type them in using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Panelists will be able to share information via the chat, but we have turned it off for the audience. I'd like to thank the sponsors for this evening's event: the Duke University Libraries, Duke Black Alumni, the Forum for Scholars and Publics, the Franklin Humanities Institute, African and African American Studies, the Department of History, and the Duke Alumni Association. And now it's my great pleasure to ask Duke Black Alumni Co-Chair Harry Jones to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Jacobs. I bring greetings from the Duke Black Alumni and join you in welcoming everyone to this program. I'd first like to introduce David M. Rubenstein. David is the co-founder and co-chairman of the Carlyle Group, a global investment firm. He graduated magna cum laude from Duke in 1970 and has served on the university's Board of Trustees. He's an active civic leader and serves on numerous boards, including those of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Gallery of Art, the World Economic Forum, the University of Chicago, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. He is among those who have pledged to donate more than half of his wealth to philanthropic causes or charities as a part of the giving pledge established by Warren Buffett and Bill Gates. Mr. Rubenstein's appreciation for historical documents is well known, as is his support for the libraries, museums, archives, and other cultural institutions that preserve them. In 2007, he purchased the last privately owned copy of the Magna Carta and placed it on permanent loan to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., so that the public could view the document. He also owns a copy of the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation, signed by Abraham Lincoln, which he loaned to the Duke University Libraries for the current exhibition. Mr. Rubenstein is also the best-selling author of 2 books on American history: The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians, and The American Experiment, Dialogues on a Dream, and a book on leadership, How to Lead, Wisdom from the World's Greatest CEOs, Founders, and Game Changers. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Thavolia Glimpf. Dr. Glimpf is the Peabody Family Distinguished Professor of History, Professor of Law, and a faculty research scholar at the Duke University Population Research Institute. She also is a Duke parent. Her work focuses on slavery, emancipation, plantation societies and economies, gender and women's history, and the era of Reconstruction. She is also the author of the prize-winning books, The Women's Fight, The Civil War's Battle for Home, Freedom, and Nation, and Out of the House of Bondage, The Transformation of the Plantation. She is the co-editor of 2 volumes of Freedom, A Documentary History of Emancipation, 1861 to 1867, and is currently completing a book manuscript entitled African American Women and Children Refugees in the Civil War. Dr. Glimpf is the past president of the Southern Historical Association and an organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer. She is a member of the Scholarly Advisory Board of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and an elected member of the Society of American Historians, the American Antiquarian Society, and the Gettysburg Foundation Board of Directors. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Naomi Nilsson. Dr. Nilsson is the director of the David M. Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. The Rubenstein Library holds over 500,000 rare books and over 10,000 manuscript collections. Its collections and exhibitions are open to the public and are integrated in classes across the disciplines. We'll drop a link in the chat so you can learn more about the Rubenstein Library. I hope you enjoy the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah and Harry. and good afternoon and welcome to all who have joined us. It is no exaggeration to say that Abraham Lincoln is a towering figure in American history. He led the United States through some of its greatest trials and through the end of American slavery. He is remembered as one of our greatest presidents. He has also been roundly criticized and vilified both during his lifetime and after. This evening, we will have an opportunity to delve into Lincoln's life and his place in history. It is a great pleasure to join David Rubenstein and Thavolia Glimp for this conversation. We will begin our exploration with a few of my questions and then turn to questions from the audience. We welcome you to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. My first question, David, is for you. It has been such a pleasure to work with you to bring the exhibition to Duke. You have written, as Harry noted, about the American experiment, our national experiment in self-government that was cobbled together some 230 years ago. This American experiment was still relatively new when Lincoln entered politics. Where does he fit into the story of the endurance of the American Republic?
Well, the experiment that I referred to in the book was an experiment in creating a representative democracy. That was relatively a novel idea. Throughout organized history, most governments were either run by despots or kings or totalitarian leaders. Democracy was relatively rare after the times of the ancient Greeks faded. And so what our founding fathers came up with was something that was quite unique. It had checks and balances. Nobody was there for life and so forth. Abraham Lincoln really deified, you could say, the founding fathers. He looked up to them. He thought what they had come up with was like holy scripture. And therefore, he took enormous pride in being an American, but also enormous pride in the experiment that he was now living through, the experiment that we call American democracy. He really believed, for example, that the words in the Constitution should be honored. And therefore, while he did not believe in slavery, his father was an ardent anti-slavery person, in fact, had moved to Illinois to avoid the slavery in Kentucky. Abraham Lincoln believed that the Constitution was holy writ, and since slavery was in the Constitution, he did not think that you should get rid of slavery by changing the Constitution in that way. He didn't think slavery should be expanded into the new states, but he wasn't really in favor of ending slavery. However, when he was elected president, he was faced the choice of states that had seceded. And while somebody might have said, well, I'm president of the United States, if the southern states want to go away, fine, I'll rule the northern states, I'll still be president of the United States. I think many people might have taken that position. He did not. He said, hey, I'm going to make sure the Union stays together. And ultimately, as a way of making certain the Union stayed together, he thought it was necessary to free the slaves through the Emancipation Proclamation. And he did so as using his so-called military powers as president of the United States. He believed that the experiment that the founding fathers had developed was one that should continue. And while he didn't really like slavery, he thought holding the Union together was essential. Now, all of us who've gone to grade school and junior high school and high school, no doubt have learned later as adults that much of what we were taught was not really correct, or we've looked at history much differently than we did before. When I was in grade school, it wasn't emphasized that our founding fathers, many of them were slave owners. It was barely mentioned. We now know, because history is much better organized and we are much more thorough, that some of the founding fathers were not exactly paragons of virtue. However, they did give us a unique form of government. Lincoln, though, was the person who kept it together. He believed in the American experiment. He believed it was a virtuous thing to keep the country together. And without doubt, one of the things that we learned at least in my grade school, was that Lincoln was the greatest president. In all the years since then, everything I've read or written about makes me believe that even more so, Lincoln was by far our greatest president, because he kept the Union together despite the enormous odds against his doing so. And he really fervently believed that the best way to proceed forward for this country was to honor the Constitution. And he was happy ultimately to see the 13th Amendment be passed by Congress. He didn't live to see the ratification, but I think one of his great legacies was not only the Emancipation Proclamation, but his hard effort to ensure that the 13th Amendment became part of our Constitution as well. So he is a great believer in the American experiment, and I think the American experiment would have fallen apart had almost anybody else been president of the United States.
Thank you. Volia, I wonder if you might pick up on this theme of emancipation and Lincoln's relationship with the end of slavery and that trajectory, and provide some additional detail. I think you may be muted.
Sure. To pick up on what David said, Lincoln certainly did believe in the Constitution, and he did everything in his power to hold the Union together when he became president. But in terms of his views on slavery, I think we all acknowledge that they changed, that Lincoln evolved. He went from being a man who always insisted that slavery was immoral, that it was sinful, that it was wrong, but who also was not quite at the point where he could say it's wrong, but I also think that Black people or African Americans are equal, right? So he thought it was wrong. You can go back decades before he became president, to 1842, when he began really speaking about this wrong, to his debates in the 1858 election campaign. He just kept saying it's wrong, but he also kept saying there is no way that we can fix this problem through emancipation except that we think about colonization, right? That Black people, as he told a delegation that came to the White House in 1862, he said, we're just different, you and I. And you will always be kind of resentful. And we, that is white Americans, will never quite be able to live with you as equals. And so I think one of the important things to remember about Lincoln was that he was a very complex man, but he was also so bright and intelligent and willing to think things through. And I'm thinking in particular about the way in which he crafted the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, his going to the telegraph office, his sitting there day after day, his writing a line here, a line there, thinking about it and going back and forth and taking the time to talk about it with the people in his cabinet. And finally, he decided after much thought that he had to do something. But I think it's really important that we, on the one hand, recognize that when he issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation on September 17th, 1862, he said, I'm giving the Confederate States and slaveholders 100 days to do something, to stop this war. And if you don't, you're going to lose all of your slaves or enslaved people. So he's still trying to juggle this, still trying to massage it, still trying to keep the Union together, but also recognize that some things are moving really fast. And what's moving really fast among those things is that enslaved people are saying, well, you have said, that is Lincoln and Congress and Northerners have said the war is not about us, but it is about us. And so by the time in the summer of 62, he's thinking really seriously about doing something, it's also clear that Black people have already begun to move, that his generals in the field are encountering large numbers of enslaved people who are coming into their camps. And Lincoln is very upset because he's got commanders like Hunter down in South Carolina who was issuing orders saying that Black people are free. And Lincoln says, no, you can't do that. But by the summer of 1862, he's ready to act. But he doesn't act until after the Battle of Antietam in 62, because there is a concern among his cabinet and among others that if he issues an Emancipation Proclamation, it will look like he's desperate. It will look like the Union has to have Black people on its side in order to win the war. And the Union had suffered in the summer of 62 some tremendous setbacks. McClellan typically had not done what Lincoln wanted him to do. Robert E. Lee had cross the Potomac. And there was concern in Washington and in Philadelphia, everywhere in the North, that Lee's army would maybe even capture the Capitol. So, and Lincoln is saying to McClellan, move, do something, but McClellan doesn't really do anything. But even so, even though he allows Lee to go back across the Potomac and flee safely, he does win a quasi victory at Antietam. And so with that quasi victory, Lincoln says, okay, I can issue this preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. And I think after that point, Lincoln is much more on board with the idea of emancipation, because he gives up on this notion of colonization, which he's been one of the most fervent advocates of for quite some time. And so when we get the real proclamation in 1863 on January the 1st, there's no mention of colonization. And importantly, very, very importantly, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 provides for the enlistment of Black men as soldiers in the Union Army. And that's really huge, because he's gone from saying to Black people in the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation that you're going to have to do this really on your own, to now saying you're going to have help. And so to Black men, like famously like Spotswood Rice, this is like so important, because it's not only that they see themselves as freeing themselves, but also having the power now to free their families. And so there's, I always like to remind my students of this wonderful letter by Spotswood Rice, a Black soldier who was in the hospital in Missouri, and who wrote to his daughter Mary to tell her that he was coming to get her, and that he had behind him the power of the federal army, and no one could keep him from getting his child, not even Katie Diggs, who was the person who claimed ownership of his family. And so there were, thousands of Black soldiers like Spotswood Rice, and thousands of women and children who said, we're going to take ourselves to the war, and then the federal government will have to decide what to do with us.
If I could add 2 points to what the professor just said. First, Lincoln was hardly an abolitionist. He never regarded himself as an abolitionist. And in fact, in his first inaugural address, he supported the then 13th Amendment, which was designed by President Buchanan and other supporters of slavery to reaffirm that slavery was part of the Constitution. So in his inaugural address, he says, yes, I support the 13th Amendment, which basically reaffirms that slavery is part of the law of the land. So it's ironic that the 13th Amendment, which actually freed slaves, was different than the 13th Amendment, the exact opposite of the one that had been proposed. On the Emancipation Proclamation itself, the challenge with it, and the reason we need the 13th Amendment, is that it was only under the War Powers Act that Lincoln executed the Emancipation Proclamation. When the war was over, theoretically, he didn't have war powers, so the slaves he had freed were no longer necessarily free. And of course, the border states were not included in the Emancipation Proclamation. So all the slaves in the border states presumably were still slaves. So that's why he needed the 13th Amendment to get through Congress, because the Emancipation Proclamation really didn't solve that problem. He actually signed it, not the preliminary one, but the final one, on January 1 of 1863. And on that day, January 1, it was a tradition that people would come to the White House and shake the hand of the President of the United States. And he shook apparently 2,500 hands that day. He went upstairs to sign the Emancipation Proclamation, but his hand was shaking from shaking all those hands. So he said, I got to calm down and make sure my hand isn't shaking, because people will think if I write it this way, I'm not really sure that I really want to have this Emancipation Proclamation, because I'm writing it with an uncertain handwriting. Ultimately, he signed it, of course. That document is in the National Archives, and it's brought out once a year. It's very fragile, once a year on January 1 for people to visit and see, but it's not easily accessible. He then signed later on 47 souvenir copies, which were designed to raise money for the equivalent of the Red Cross then, and only about 8 of them sold. They were sold to be sold for $10 a piece, but nobody wanted to buy them. So there are now about 20 some of them left in circulation. And I have one is in this display here, and I've lent another one I own to the African American History and Culture Museum in Washington on a long-term loan. So, and interestingly, when Lincoln signed this document and signed other things of significance, he would write Abraham Lincoln. If it was insignificant, he would just write, or less significant, he'd write A. Lincoln. So if he really meant it, he would write his full name as he did on the Emancipation Proclamation.
Well, it's very special for us here at Duke to have that copy on display in the Biddle Rare Book Room. Thank you for loaning it. And thank you for that additional information. Perhaps I shall turn to a slightly different topic. We have some questions from the audience. Much has been made about Lincoln's team of rivals strategy. In our own fraught time, do you think Lincoln would assemble a bipartisan cabinet of Republicans and Democrats? And also it appears that Lincoln doubted his efforts in keeping the Union together would succeed. I open the floor for either of you to address that question. Thavolia, perhaps you might go first.
Yeah, I'll start with the last question. I mean, there were many moments when Lincoln doubted that he would be able to effectively lead the country and keep the Union together. You know, he would really have to be sort of led back by, you know, the people around him, including his wife and also including his cabinet ministers, when he really got depressed. And he got depressed when McClellan wouldn't move. I don't know what that was, but he got depressed in 1864 as the presidential election, you know, came around, and he was really, really worried that he would lose the election. And, you know, he ended up winning, but prior to his victory in 1864, that may have been, I think, the darkest moment for him. And we can say, well, you know, what about these horrendous losses in battle on the battlefield with hundreds of thousands of men losing their lives? Yeah, he was really, really saddened by that. But it was thinking, I think, that he might not be able to carry this task forward past 1864. And so he actually wrote a letter that he shared with people after he won, in which he talked about what he was going to do to help whoever won the election. So I think that kind of speaks to the first question about, you know, Doris Goodwin in her book about the team of rivals. I'm not sure how he would, you know, act today in this situation, but I think he did, you know, pull into his cabinet men who had opposed him when he first ran for the presidency. So he had a team of rivals. He had a team of men who didn't, some of them, you know, thought he was uncouth or, you know, not bright enough. You know, he didn't have a high school education or even much of an elementary education, let alone a college degree. And so he was, you know, some of the cabinet members looked down upon him, but I think by the end, they had all come to respect him. And so maybe he would today be able to cobble together a team of rivals. But I don't know. I think today is such a different situation.
When Doris Kearns Goodwin was writing that book, many people said to her, there are already about 15,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. What more can you really come up with that hasn't been written? And it was a challenge. And as she was thinking it through, it just dawned on her one day that Lincoln had put these people in the cabinet who had run against him for president. I think 3 had run against him, and a fourth was what I thought about running against him. But let's be honest, they were all in his party. They were not different parties. He didn't go out and get rivals from other political parties. They were all in his Republican Party. So I think, to answer the question, I doubt that Lincoln today would have reached out to other parties to put people in his cabinet, because he didn't do it then. He just brought rivals from his own party.
So to build on the conversation about the evolution of Lincoln's positions on slavery and on abolition, on emancipation, a questioner wonders whether the evidence isn't soft that his family moved, the family from Kentucky, because of anti-slavery ideologies. And so is wondering about later recollections and stories rather than contemporary documents being the basis of some of the stories that were passed down about Lincoln or the history that, that we remember. So perhaps this is a question of sources. Can you address the sources for what we know about, particularly Abraham Lincoln's early life?
I'm happy. Would you like to start?
No, you can go ahead. I'll jump in.
Everybody rewrites their own life history, I think. Everybody wants to kind of put their best foot forward. So I suspect everybody probably says things about their early life that might not be completely accurate. And I think Lincoln wanted to convey the idea that his father was so against slavery that that he moved the family out of the state. Maybe that's true, maybe not. It's hard to know because Lincoln had a terrible relationship with his father. It was barely civil, and he really couldn't wait to escape being around his father, honestly. And as soon as he was of age, he did leave. It sounds like a good story, like Lincoln, like Washington on the cherry tree. You know, why not have a couple good myths? So it may be true that he really got his anti-slavery views from his father, and his father moved from Kentucky for that reason. I don't think we really know for certain because there just wasn't a lot of history. His father was illiterate and didn't write anything down about any of this, and so we don't really know.
Just to add to what David said, history is written and revised constantly. And so what we thought we knew about Lincoln was based, on narratives written by people like his best friend. It was based on narratives written by historians right after the war in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And the vast majority of those narratives had very little to say about Lincoln, his relationship with enslaved people beyond the fact that he was the emancipator. So I think historians over the last 50 years or more have reached deeper into the archive and pulled out sources. One of the projects that I was gratefully involved with at the University of Maryland, the Freedmen and Southern Society project. That project is based on tens of thousands of documents culled from millions of documents at the National Archives that had been filed away, but no one had really looked at since they were filed away. And the project has pulled documents that show men writing like Spotswood Rice that show women writing to the president and asking them, for example, as one Black woman did, can you just tell me whether or not I'm free, whether or not I can go visit my family on the Eastern Shore. So to sum it up, I think that the impressions that we had of Lincoln and the war and emancipation were limited because of the sources that were used. And now we have a much more expansive view of Lincoln. We have a much more complicated view of Lincoln that takes into consideration, as David said, that he was not an abolitionist, but he was a man who saw slavery as something that was just immoral and wrong. And so even if he wanted to colonize free Blacks, I think complicating this narrative also means thinking about how enslaved people or African-American people thought about colonization. I think that it's too easy to say, okay, Lincoln wanted to colonize them and they were all saying no. That's not true. There were some Black people who said, I want to go, this country is crazy. I can't make it here. And so hundreds left. I mean, in one situation, it was a horrible colonization that Lincoln had supported, and they ended up coming back. But the point, I think, is that what historians have done in recent decades is to provide a story that's not only more complicated, but that's grounded in a much wider variety of sources in the archive.
On the colonization concept, that was a very relatively common one in some northern states. In fact, when Lincoln was a member of Congress for 2 years, he actually introduced a bill that would have had colonization from slaves freed from the District of Columbia. It didn't get very far. But even after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by Lincoln, he still met with Black leaders and tried to convince them to leave, to go to a place that he was talking about in Latin America or Central America. So he still believed in the concept. Eventually, the Black leaders said, we're not leaving, and he kind of dropped the idea. But it wasn't something that he thought was such a terrible idea, even after the Emancipation Proclamation.
Yeah, I was thinking too of the emancipation of slaves in the nation's capital, right, in 1862. And that document, that emancipation, the congressional measure, included or set aside $100,000 to be used to colonize Black people. And some of that money was used to colonize a group of Black people, the group that ended up coming back. And finally, Lincoln took the balance that was left in the account and pulled it out because he was done with this, trying to make this work.
Ironically, when the great emancipator, as Lincoln was later called, had the Lincoln Memorial at dedication, the President of the United States spoke at it, and Blacks were not allowed to sit with whites. The Blacks who attended had to stand in the fields. And even the one Black speaker who was allowed to speak, he had to stand in the fields because even though we're honoring Lincoln, it was still in the country in that time completely and totally segregated. And while Blacks were not slaves, they certainly weren't first-class citizens.
David, you just mentioned Black leaders meeting with Lincoln. We have a question about Lincoln's growth over time on the subject of slavery, as well as on citizenship, and whether that was influenced by African-American interlocutors, including Frederick Douglass. So can you speak to his interaction with other Black leaders?
What, David, I think the interaction with Douglass is really fascinating because the first time that Douglass goes to the White House, he goes uninvited. Douglass is not among the group that Lincoln meets with in 1862, the group that he tells, like, prepare your people for colonization. But he goes uninvited in 1863, and he talks about in his narrative, sort of pushing aside or going through this crowd of people waiting to see Lincoln and making his way up uninvited. The next two times that he meets with Lincoln, in 1864 and 1865, he goes to the White House as an invited guest. And in 1864, Lincoln calls him in and to help to get his advice on how to help win the war, and in particular, how to help win it with the assistance of Black people. And it's at that point that Douglass, comes back from this meeting and he says, Lincoln wants me to establish this kind of core, this of people who will go into the South and tell enslaved people to leave. But that really never gets off the ground. And of course, the last time Douglass goes to the White House is when Lincoln invites him to hear his second inauguration address in 1865. But I think Douglass had a tremendous influence on Lincoln. He saw in Douglass not some representative Black man, but he saw in Douglass this really intelligent man who could help him win the war, who by telling him, like Douglass said, look, I got two sons fighting in this war. And so I think Lincoln was very taken with Douglass, even though Douglass, if you read his narratives very closely, Douglass admired Lincoln, but in the end, he also thought that Lincoln could have done more.
Yes, I think Lincoln did not invite Douglass to be part of the group of African Americans who came to the White House to talk about colonization. He was not in that meeting. But at the second inaugural you just referred to, Lincoln did see Douglass, and he said, there's my friend. I would say that my own view is that African Americans had modest influence on Lincoln. I think the greater influence was abolitionists and that part of the Republican Party that really believed in abolition and were pushing it much harder on that issue. They had much more influence, I think, than than African Americans did. In part, remember, African Americans didn't have the right to vote. And a lot of the people who he wanted to get support from were people who wanted to have more progress on slavery. And those people were voting. And he, of course, didn't think he would win the 1864 election. But I suspect to some extent, he was probably influenced more by people like Horace Greeley and others whom he had problems, but people who were writing things that he should be tougher on slavery, on fighting slavery than he was. But, that's just my view.
Since the Emancipation Proclamation addressed only enslaved people in states under active insurrection, does it seem that the decision to issue it was a war strategy, not a movement of principle?
Well, Lincoln made no bones about what this document was. He was very explicit in the document and in his speeches that it was a war measure. So there's no debate about that. Even the British foreign minister said, like, what is this? Basically, he said this document has no principles because it leaves intact slavery in the Union where Lincoln has control, and emancipates slaves in the areas of the South where the Union has no control. So it's a war measure. And as a war measure, it turns out to be effective because it does lead to the enlistment of some 200,000 African-American men. It does encourage Black people, enslaved people in particular, to get up and go. So hundreds of thousands of enslaved people leave the plantations and move to these refugee camps into Union lines. So it's not a principled document in the way that many people would want it to be, but it accomplishes what Lincoln wants it to accomplish. And he's never unclear about the fact that it's a military measure issued on his power as commander-in-chief. So it doesn't, I'm going back to what David was talking about at the beginning. Lincoln's reverence for the Constitution remains. And so he's still not going to do anything that would, to his mind, violate the Constitution or take on powers not delegated to him by the Constitution.
Interestingly, Lincoln was probably our greatest writer as president. You could say Jefferson wasn't bad either, but Lincoln wrote by himself. He didn't have speechwriters to write the Gettysburg Address, and he wrote by himself the second inaugural address. Their rhetoric in those speeches are unbelievable. Why is it in the Emancipation Proclamation there's no wonderful rhetoric? There's no great language about why we should do this. The answer apparently is that he was very afraid if he gave an explanation about the importance of doing this and why slavery was an improper kind of procedure. He was afraid that the Supreme Court would overturn the Emancipation Proclamation. He was very afraid of giving a reason for doing this. He just made it a military measure and made it very simple as a kind of document. It doesn't have any beautiful rhetoric. A very famous historian called it as, having the eloquence of a bill of lading. It wasn't really a wonderfully written document, in part because Lincoln was trying to have an airtight legal document that couldn't be overturned by the Supreme Court, and he accomplished that.
And he was also trying to keep the border states in the Union. So when people say, well, why didn't he emancipate enslaved people in the border states of Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri? He still wanted to keep those states on the side of the Union. And at some point he called the border state politicians into the White House and said, look, the game's up. You really should go ahead and find a way to emancipate enslaved people in your states, and the border states said no way. And so slavery would disintegrate in those border states, even though the border state politicians did not act to make it end. So I think Lincoln, you're right that this document does not have the soaring language of the Gettysburg Address and even the first inaugural address, or even the second inaugural address. And when he at least, is talking about, if God if God wants us to win, basically we'll win. But he says, look, it doesn't appear that we can do this without emancipation. But he still, I think, let me just put it this way, in the second inaugural address, there is some of that soaring language when he says, we have taken 250 years of the labor of enslaved people, and that has to be compensated for. And so you get a real difference between the first and the second inaugural address. In the first, he's saying, we're at this moment at the beginning of the war, and the goal is to hold the Union together, to keep slavery intact. The second inaugural address, March 4th, 1865, that's no longer on the table, right? And so he's now saying that not only is slavery wrong, but we have to make amends for what we've done. And I think that's really important in terms of thinking about his evolution as a politician and as a human being.
Well, yeah, you had mentioned that the Emancipation Proclamation provided for African Americans to be soldiers, African American men. There's a question related to that. Lincoln's view of Black men, like Ulysses Grant's view, no doubt changed with the performance of Black soldiers. Both men, I believe, wanted Black soldiers to be paid the same as white soldiers and to be treated like other Union soldiers if they were prisoners of war. Can you comment on their appreciation of the Black soldier?
Well,
Go ahead, David.
Well, Frederick Douglass was not happy about that because Black soldiers were being paid far less than white soldiers for the same job. And so Frederick Douglass went to the White House at one point, I think that's his last meeting with Lincoln, to complain about this. He didn't make any progress, but it was clear that that the government was not going to pay Black soldiers the same that they paid white soldiers. In fact, many people believed it was dangerous to give Black soldiers guns. And it was controversial actually having Black soldiers fight alongside Northern soldiers. Some of the Northern soldiers weren't exactly thrilled with that. Ironically, or very strangely, at the end of the war, there were some slaves not freed who were fighting on the behalf of the South. Somehow, some of the slaves in the South were importuned somehow to fight on behalf of the Southern side. But in any event, there was about 200,000 Northerners who fought. And it was thought that once they had fought, how could you put them back and make them slaves again and so forth? And it was a situation that Lincoln had a lot of political challenges in dealing with the fact that Blacks were not only fighting, having guns, and the Blacks were feeling, wait, we're not being paid anywhere close to what the whites are being paid for the same thing. It was a complicated situation for sure.
Yeah, so just to add to that, because of the pay differential, Black soldiers are paid $3 less per month than white soldiers, which led to, the famous protests of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry. Those of you who've seen the movie Glory will know a lot about that. And Black soldiers said, we are here to do more than dig ditches. We are here to do more than build fortifications. We want to fight. And so Lincoln and many Northerners in general were concerned about Black men fighting. And there was also among Americans, white Americans, North and South, this idea that if you put Black men in the army and you give them guns and you send them out to fight enslavers, they're going to get before their putative masters and go, oh my God, I can't do this. But quite the opposite happened. They didn't back down when they were facing Confederate forces, and which led to their bravery, in fact, would lead to their being massacred at places like Fort Pillow by Confederate forces. So I think Lincoln and Northerners in general were concerned. White soldiers from the North were concerned. It was a problem finding white men to officer Black regiments because Black men are not allowed to officer these regiments. But they found some really good people to do it for the most part. But Northern soldiers had also to be brought along, or they brought themselves along on this process of supporting Black people and emancipation. The vast majority of Northern soldiers went to war for union, not for emancipation. And they remained committed to that cause throughout the war. But at the same time, when you have a soldier from Iowa who's never really encountered Black people before to any significant extent, and he's lost his way after a battle, and some Black family takes him into their cabin and protects him and feeds him and gives him some clothes and shows him how to get back to his unit. Those kinds of experiences help to change the opinion of Northern soldiers. Plus, Northern soldiers were not stupid. They said increasingly, look, we are facing fortifications built by enslaved people because the Confederacy was using enslaved people to build, forcing them to build fortifications. And so Northern, this is crazy. We're working with our hands tied behind our backs. And so Northern soldiers increasingly welcomed this extra military force that they got from the enlistment of Black soldiers. And just one comment about the Confederacy, Black soldiers in the Confederacy. It was at the very end, in April of 1865, that the Confederate government decided to enlist Black soldiers, and the war ended 2 weeks later. I believe they raised 2 companies because Lee was in favor of it and so forth. But you know, those 2 companies never really got to the battlefield, right?
You know, interestingly, Drew Faust in her book, Republic of Suffering, points out that despite the Blacks and whites fighting together, when they were killed, they couldn't be buried together. Blacks had to be buried separately from whites. It had a very strange system there in the Civil War. Southerners couldn't be buried alongside Northerners. Whites couldn't be buried alongside Blacks. Officers couldn't be buried alongside enlisted men. It was a complicated situation. But interestingly, you could be fighting alongside a white person if you're a Black soldier, and if you're both killed, you couldn't be buried together.
Yeah.
Well, we are getting towards the end of our time. I appreciate all the questions that have been sent in, and I'm sorry that we won't be able to ask all of them this evening, but we will certainly note them down. I have one final question for both David and Thavolia. Is there an item in the exhibition that you would highlight for visitors? One thing that we might look for when we visit the exhibition?
I'll start, David. I mean, first of all, David, thank you for loaning us these wonderful documents, which I have enjoyed going over to visit. There's so many, Naomi, that I would recommend people, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, but I think the one that kind of stood out to me, because it's not one that's really well known, but it stood out to me for a reason I'll tell you about. It's called the Fugitive Slave Law and Its Victims. You remember that one, David? The
Yes.
Fugitive Slave Law and Its Victims. And this document was written in the aftermath of the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, which made it easier for slaveholders or enslavers to capture men and women and children who ran away. And what's really remarkable about it is that it lists several hundred people by name who were captured, whose fate was determined by the passage of this law in 1850 that was part of the larger compromise of 1850. And so I can't wait to teaching a course on the Civil War now, and I can't wait to have my students go through it, because, you know, among the names there are some that you will, people in the audience would easily recognize, like Margaret Garner, who famously crossed the icy river to get to Ohio. But it's even the first person who was captured under the 1850 law is named in this document. So for me, that's it.
Let me mention one final thing. The 13th Amendment, which was the amendment that obviously was ratified after Lincoln was assassinated. He lived only a few days after it was passed. after it was passed by Congress, and as we know, you have to have 2/3 of each house pass it, Lincoln actually signed several of these, you could say, documents. He was admonished by Congress. Congress passed a resolution criticizing Lincoln for signing the 13th Amendment. Why? Because the Congress wanted to make certain that it was understood the presidents have nothing to do with constitutional amendments. They can lobby them perhaps, but they're not supposed to be involved in it. And so Congress was amazingly upset that Lincoln actually signed a few of these. One of them is in the collection. But it just seems strange to me that Lincoln would be criticized for having signed the 13th Amendment, but that's what actually happened.
I think we have time for one additional question. And David, this is a question that Thavolia had asked when we had met earlier, and that is about your Americana collection. What is your motivation in building an Americana collection, and how do you decide what should be in that collection?
Well, I am a big believer in the importance of preserving history, and I'm a big believer in books. And I do think that you get more out of reading an actual text of something that's historic and preserving it than you was reading the text on a computer slide. The human brain has not yet evolved so that it's the same experience seeing something on a computer slide as seeing something actually that is the real thing that Lincoln might have signed or some other first printing that occurred. My collection is designed to be American oriented because that's what I care about the most. And it's designed to preserve some documents for future purposes. And it basically consists of first editions in terms of books or other things that are relatively rare to see. And it's taken a number of years to put it together. But I'm really designing it to kind of help educate people about things and excite people about learning about history, because in the end, if people aren't excited about learning about history, we'll forget what happened in history and we'll, as one famous historian said, be condemned to relive the mistakes of the past. So it's really designed to be a thank you to America for enabling me to be in a position to be able to have this collection to some extent as well.
Thank you. And one final question from our audience, which is, are there some books of history that you would recommend on Lincoln and his time, in addition to the ones that you both have authored?
Go ahead.
Well, I'd say The Team of Rivals is an excellent book. I would say that's, you know, as good a book on Lincoln's presidency as you're gonna get. Some of the books that were written earlier by Carl Sandburg or others are probably dated a little bit now, but there's no lack of Lincoln books coming out every year. Every year there's a great new one, and I'll just mention one that came out recently, written by Ted Widmer. It's about Lincoln's travel from Springfield, Illinois to Washington, D.C., and it points out all the cities that he visited before he got to Washington, and then the assassination plot that was foiled a bit in Baltimore, and how he had to sneak into Washington, D.C. It's something I hadn't read before about how Lincoln came to Washington, but it took him quite a while to get here by train, and he was stopping in major cities, making speeches all along the way. And he had a copy of his inaugural address with him, and he was afraid he was going to lose it. Somebody was going to steal it. But it's a really good new book about Lincoln, and I highly recommend it, by Ted Widmer.
I also recommend any number of books by Eric Foner, and I hesitate to name too many other people for fear I'll not name somebody. You're like, why didn't you name me? But you know, as David pointed out, there are over 15,000 books on Lincoln, and as someone once said, no other one figure has had as many books written about him other than God or Jesus Christ.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those recommendations and for sifting a few books out of the many written about Lincoln and bringing them to our attention. And so with that, yes, David. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I would like to thank you both for this rich and wide-ranging conversation this evening. You've given us a greater appreciation of the man behind the myths and of the significance of Lincoln's life and legacy for us today. I'd like to thank our audience for their smart and interesting questions. And as I mentioned, we have noted them down. I invite everyone to visit the exhibition. It will be open in the Rubenstein Library through May 14th. and will be perpetually in our online exhibit as well. Again, thank you, David, for loaning the selections from your collection to Duke so they can be shared with the public. And Thiboli, we look forward to welcoming your classes in to see them.
Thank you.
It was an honor to be with you this evening, and on behalf of the Duke Libraries and the Duke Black Alumni Association, I'd like to wish everyone a happy Black History Month. Good night.